comments below. So Iraq, it is the 36th largest country on the entire planet, with an estimated population of 38,146,025 people as of 2016. And with that population, it's got a pretty good density, equaling roughly 82.7 people per kilometer square. Now with all these people, it's got to have a pretty good land size, right? Well, roughly it sits at being the 59th largest country, equaling 437,702 kilometers square. So with all these people and all this great land, how does the country make money? Well, when it comes to money, it's really fascinating and interesting. For example, it has a GDP of $612 billion, making it the 37th largest in the world, with also a GDP per capita of $16,551. But when it comes to that GDP, what are the imports and exports of the country? Iraq itself has approximately $48.2 billion in exports, making it the 48th largest, while having $31.7 billion in imports. And what's amazing about this country is that 98% of its exports are due to crude petroleum. This makes it the country that has the highest single dependable source for an export. And I'm pretty thrown off by that, because I've never seen a country have one resource that high. I've seen 60%, I've seen 50% of certain resources, but not 98%. But as for its second highest, it is gold, being roughly 0.44%. And we're going to talk a little bit more about oil and crude petroleum a little bit later, but we got to talk about some imports. For example, the one thing that is really good about the country is that its imports are really balanced, with the highest being cars, roughly being 2.8%. And out of all these people, there's roughly 8.2 million people in Iraq that are part of the labor force. And out of all the people within the country, only about 25% as of 2012 were considered unemployed. However, that dropped in 2014 to roughly about 16%. So let's jump back to oil, because, well, Iraq's got a lot of it. As a matter of fact, it's considered the second to third largest country in the world when it comes to oil reserves. They have approximately 140 billion barrels, and in 2006, they were producing roughly about 2 million barrels a day. And even though there's been conflict and an invasion, by the year 2016, they had increased production, being capable of producing 4.55 million barrels a day. So we've talked about oil and economy, but now let's talk about the country itself. For example, where does the name Iraq come from? Well, it's been pretty much around since the 16th century, with the word originating from Al-Iraq. And of course, there are many different theories of the origin of the name, but one thing for sure, this word means that it is deeply rooted, well-watered, or fertile. Now, the country itself has a very unique landscape, and roughly about 20% of it is mountainous, with Chikadar being the tallest mountain, coming in at 3,611 meters tall. And within these mountains, they are the really only forested places throughout the entire country. And one of the reasons for this is that the country really doesn't have a lot of lakes. And not to include reservoirs, but I did look into it, and it looks like, well, Iraq only has about 9 major lakes. And there's probably more if you include places like the Narjaf Sea, which is very small, but the largest of these lakes is theoretically Lake Tharthar, being 2,710 kilometers square, and roughly 130 to 213 feet deep. Now, the reason I say that it is technically this lake is because the Tharthar Depression was actually turned into an artificial reservoir to collect waters from the Tigris River in 1956. So theoretically, it's not actually a real lake because it's artificial, but it is the biggest one in the country, so I gotta include it. Now, as for the rest of the landscape, about 2/5 of it is covered in desert, equaling a total of 104,000 to approximately 168,000 kilometers square. And what's really fascinating about this desert, well, most of the deserts in all of the Middle East, is their dust storms. These crazy storms will blow sands miles and miles away, as it pushes the sand way up in the air, literally being seen as a wall of sand coming for you. Now, these will happen generally 20 to 50 days a year within the country, and they can go up to about 40 kilometers per hour. As well as in the country, they are commonly known as shamals, which usually occur during the summer seasons. And as for these storms, they can reach a height of up to 3,000 to 6,000 feet. And like I said, these things will go for miles. As a matter of fact, the sand usually is blown from Syria to Jordan as the winds come over the hills of Turkey and carry the sand southwest. Now, within this land, it also has a very deeply rooted culture. A culture that needs to be protected. As a matter of fact, the country itself has 5 UNESCO zones. And unfortunately, out of these 5, 3 of them are listed as endangered. Yes, believe it or not, the UNESCO has listed danger sites. And one in particular within the country is the beautiful ruins of Hatra. The reason for this danger is because in 2015, a video showed the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant military group destroying certain structures within this zone. Fortunately, by the year 2017, the area was completely liberated from these militant groups. But as for this structure, it is believed to have been built by the Assyrians in the 2nd or 3rd century BC. However, it was eventually abandoned in 241 AD. But Hatra itself was thought to possibly be the capital for the first Arab kingdom until it was invaded by the Roman Empire. And before the militant groups came in 2015, it was one of the most preserved Parthian cities with statues and buildings and giant walls. An interesting fact, Saddam Hussein, although you might have mixed feelings about him, helped restore this structure. He ordered an $80 million restoration on the city, and it's interesting enough that some of the new bricks put in the structure have his name on them. However, as for Hatra, it became inscribed in 1985, and believe it or not, it was also featured in the opening shot of the movie The Exorcist in 1979. It's also fascinating to know that if you've seen that movie, the excavating site that's actually happening at that opening shot, well, there was an actual excavation happening at the time they were filming. But yeah, that is Iraq. Man, what a fascinating and amazing country to learn about. And I gotta admit, there are some things